Whiskey Rebellion and Sovereignty in the Early American Republic. My name is Dr. Paul Douglas Newman, and I'm a professor of early American history at the University of Pittsburgh at Johnstown. I'm the author of a book about a rebellion in the 1790s, the lesser-known Freeze Rebellion, The Enduring Struggle for the American Revolution, published by the University of Pennsylvania Press in 2004. And most recently, I've just published an essay in a book entitled Revolutionary Prophecies, the Founders and America's Future. And that essay is about the Shays, Whiskey, and Freeze rebellions, comparing them and the quote unquote rebels as America's agrarian founding fathers and generation. Joining us today are two speakers, experts, scholars, writers. First, Mr. William Hoagland. William Hoagland is the author of narrative books on little discussed aspects of founding United States history, including the Whiskey Rebellion, Declaration, and Autumn of the Black Snake. His next book on the hardball political fights over Alexander Hamilton's plan of national finance is under contract to Farrar, Straus, and Giroux. Hoagland gives keynote talks on a wide range of lively U.S. history topics, addressing both corporate conventions and public institutions, including the National Archives, the Museum of American Finance History, the John Adams National Historic Park, and many more. He has appeared on PBS television, History Detectives, CBS Television's Good Morning America, C-SPAN, and many public radio shows. His newsletter, Hoagland's Bad History, can be found on Substack. Also joining us is Professor Terry Booten. Terry Booten is an associate professor of history at the University of Maryland, Baltimore campus. He was the 2012 to 2015 presidential teaching professor at UMBC and an Organization of American Historians, OAH, distinguished lecturer. His research examines the meaning and practice of democracy during the era of the American Revolution. His first book, Taming Democracy, The People, the Founders, and the Troubled Ending of the American Revolution, published by Oxford University Press in 2007, won the 2008 Philip S. Klein Book Prize and was an honorable mention for the Francis Tavern Museum Book Award. Currently, he is working on a new book entitled Foreign Founders: How European Financiers Helped Write the Constitution, that explores the influence of foreign investors in shaping the nation's founding moment. Now, we'll hear first for about 12 to 14 minutes from William Hoagland, followed by Terry Booten. During their presentations, please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen to submit any questions you will have. I will make a tabulation of those questions, and following both presentations, I will engage both scholars and writers in a conversation that includes your questions and some of my own. And so now I'd like to go ahead and turn over our program to Mr. William Hoagland.
Thank you, Paul. I usually just jump right into what I want to say, and not talk about where I am and why I'm here. But on this one, I just do need to say, and it will become relevant to the question before us, actually. I do need to say that I was delighted to be asked to be part of this panel even before I knew who else was on the panel. But it was a particular delight to find out that Terry and Paul were both going to be here too, because as I just said privately, and I really need to say publicly, what did I know about the Whiskey Rebellion really in any kind of realistic sense before I read Terry's then unpublished work on it? And that started not just me on the Whiskey Rebellion, but started an entire range of thinking I had not engaged in before. And what were my feelings when I read a very positive review by Paul in one of the scholarly journals? The underlying issue here that's relevant, I think, is A, I'm delighted to be here, of course, especially with these two, but also B, I'm not a scholar. I write for a general audience. I write for the kind of audience that likes to read books about interesting things, not people already well-versed in the subject. And so I rely on scholarship, and I couldn't really function well without some approval and endorsement from the scholarly world. I couldn't do the kind of popular writing that I try to do. But I do, I am a pop writer in that sense, and I function in a kind of pop world, and I like pop. I like American pop. I like pop song, for example, as well. I like pop narrative. So I come from in addressing the question of the importance of the Whiskey Rebellion, which is kind of one of the things we're really focusing on here today, was Washington correct in seeing it, if he really did, as a fundamental sort of moment in establishing American sovereignty, maybe one of the most important things of his administration, his behavior in response to it, and maybe one of the most important things in the founding period. Because I come to these stories with not scholarly skills so much as maybe dramaturgical skills, there's a way in which there's no way I can dissent really from Washington's point of view on that. Because for me, I mean, there's the fact that I centered the Whiskey Rebellion in a narrative book. So if I centered it in a narrative book, it takes a certain kind of importance for me that isn't really justified by argument so much as by a desire to find a climactic moment and a fertile moment and try to unearth what's going on in terms of personality and politics and economics in that moment. And so I have a peculiar relationship to the whole idea of the relative importance of that particular moment, the Whiskey Rebellion, and its suppression by Washington and what that meant. Because actually for me, I centered it in my first book, and it was in cracking open the Whiskey Rebellion really myself that I began to develop the entire critique of the founding period that I am in the process, I find, of developing as the world in which my dramas take place. So there's a little bit of a cart and horse problem. Like, am I really in a position to say whether it was objectively speaking as important as Washington thought it was? For me, yes, but for all the reasons I've just mentioned. What I kind of get interested in then is the question of, like, I mean, in centering the Whiskey Rebellion and in beginning to see the world of the founding as to some extent revolving around it, as I began to do simply as a dramatist, say, I got interested in the question of, like, well, why am I drawn to this story? I mean, I'm not trying to find drama where it doesn't exist. I'm looking for those kind of climactic moments. And so I do think, you know, there's method to it, even though I'm kind of giving this disclaimer about where I'm coming from on it. I do think it was crucially important. And we could also look at it as maybe crucially important to how we think about the country today. The issues that it raises seem highly relevant today. And it was a kind of a watershed of something, I think, beyond, you know, it's not like my desire to dramatize creates the watershed. I think I'm attracted to things where I think I can sort of sniff a watershed. So I guess that's the issue to me. And I think the other signal thing of the Washington administration is something else that's not widely discussed, which I've also written a book about. And the reason I wrote it is because I think it is the other signal achievement, which is the invasion and finally the successful invasion and the conquest of the territory north and west of the Ohio River, which was ceded to the US by Britain to end the Revolutionary War as part of ending the Revolutionary War, but in fact was held, developed, used, and inhabited and so forth by a number of other nations who were there and had to be conquered by Washington in order to establish sovereignty even further west than Pittsburgh, say, the Pittsburgh area, say. So I see these as sort of twinned, and they certainly chronologically, they're twinned events that are major watersheds. So in terms of both drama and some kind of trying to get a realistic view of that period and what was going on in the Washington administration and what was at stake dramatically, what was at stake literally in the Whiskey Rebellion and in its suppression, or really, I like to say the suppression of the populace of Western Pennsylvania, not so much the suppression of the Whiskey Rebellion. And we can probably talk about that further as we get further into this. What was at stake was really, to me, a kind of American democracy. That's what was, and I'm saying a kind of for a couple of reasons. I'll kind of finish this out by explaining, but a kind of American democracy was at stake right there at the founding period, right there at the founding moment, at the moment of, in fact, establishing US sovereignty west of the Appalachians, which is what the suppression of that part of the country, military suppression by Washington, really accomplished, I guess. And when I say kind of democracy, I'm qualifying it by saying kind of for a couple of reasons. One is that it's always important to acknowledge when talking about the Whiskey Rebels and others like them, for them, and then the whole tradition that they're in, that it wouldn't necessarily qualify today as the democracy that most of us would call democratic, because we are talking about largely, I would say, the white male working class, or the white working class, with men in powerful, dominant positions. And so we're not talking about necessarily an inclusive view of democracy on the part of the people who became called whiskey rebels. But I'm also going to say that it was something of maybe a radical kind of democracy from the point of view of the anti-democratic forces in the country, the Washingtons and Hamiltons. Hamilton, who saw democracy as what he called, the poison. He didn't make any bones about this. Radical in the sense that it seems there was a kind of an alliance between, say, small ownership and labor and landless labor, even unpropertied people, and an alliance there in which the idea of property, sufficient property to participate politically, was had been challenged for a long time, and came to this, to me, kind of culmination in the 1790s in a very negative response by a lot of ordinary people to the Hamiltonian funding plan, which tended by design to concentrate power and concentrate economic resources and access to credit and so forth in the hands of the kinds of small upscale elite that Hamilton wanted to encourage for completely cogent reasons that he did not actually make any bones about. But in that conflict that was long ongoing and came to a kind of a climax in the summer and fall of 1794. I'll kind of wrap this up by saying, if that's a dramatic climax, well, then what happened? What happened to it? If democracy, a kind of American democracy, was at stake, a kind of radical on the one hand and not inclusive enough on the other kind of democracy was at stake, and if it were suppressed by Washington in 1794, and with Hamilton actually on the scene carrying out the details of that suppression. The interesting question to me to consider is, do we see that democracy then coming back to life with the exit of the Federalists, the entrance of Jeffersonian democracy, and then further extended in, say, Jacksonian democracy? And I think there's a tendency to think so, because certainly in the biographies of some of the people involved, well, some of the people associated with the Whiskey Rebellion became pretty hardcore Jeffersonians, and say a William Findley can be seen as, has been seen by some as sort of a proto-Jacksonian even type. Well, okay, there's an argument to be made there. But for me, what I've kind of begun to see, I see, is that the kinds of thinking that it really attended the Whiskey Rebellion, some of the most interesting kinds of thinking about democracy that attended the Whiskey Rebellion, don't really, that return of the repressed doesn't really happen for me until we start to get pretty assertive labor organizing later on, but until we get into maybe some of Bryan's kind of populism and fights against monopoly and fights against the gold standard, and then doesn't really come to any kind of fruition for me, I think, until the New Deal, really. I think there was some thinking around the kind of democracy I'm talking about, not only in the Whiskey Rebellion, but leading up to it for all those years, that we don't really see coming about until the New Deal, maybe the Great Society, those kinds of assertive government, national government programs dedicated to leveling playing fields economically. And so that's kind of going to the biggest possible frame from the question that was asked. But ultimately, my answer to that question is kind of, with all possible qualifications, a kind of a yes. I think it was one of the most, I think the drama of that event, the rebellion itself, the protests before it, the suppression of it, really were one of the signal benchmark moments of the Washington administration and of what went into the founding. And then the interesting question becomes, then what? Then what happened? So I'll leave it there and turn it back to Paul, or straight over to Terry, however we should be doing this.
I'll take it right from there, Paul, if you want, if that's okay. My thinking on this has changed over time. and my thinking on this is when I started this as a graduate student. And in around the time of the Whiskey Rebellion bicentennial. And at that point in time, as a graduate student working on a dissertation that started as a reexamination of the Whiskey Rebellion, I was like, this is the most important event ever. And yes, George Washington is absolutely right. Like, this is central to the American experience and the founding. My views of that over time will change, but I want to, like, I started on this around 1994. I was doing the research in Western Pennsylvania while Pennsylvania was holding its Whiskey Rebellion bicentennial celebrations. And so I went all around to a number of the different sort of celebrations that were being held. And, what struck me was the strange mixed message that the bicentennial was celebrating, which I think gets to the heart of our problem as a nation dealing and understanding and really appreciating what was going on in 1794. And that is, right, on one hand, a lot of the publications and the rest were celebrating the rebels, right? Because they were trying to, this will take you, the brochure prompts like, this will take you back in time to the creation of American democracy, and making it seem like the rebels were the ones who were creating democracy. And at the celebrations, like they hired this one in Carlisle, Pennsylvania. They had this reenactment. They hired a George Washington impersonator who I was assured by event organizers was the Cadillac of George Washington impersonators. And so this guy gave a speech at the local church that George Washington had given. So there's still, but the, one page of the brochure is celebrating the creation of democracy by the so-called rebels. And on the other page, we're talking about how George Washington saved us from the greatest crisis, right? That the new republic faced, which is sort of like, well, what's the crisis? It's democracy's the crisis. And this, I think, gets to the heart of the issue. And as I myself started to come to terms more with that and really appreciate what digging deeper into the rebellion itself, digging deeper into the petitions that these farmers were writing and their economic circumstances and what was happening and court records, and finding that these folks had talked about being foreclosed because they couldn't get their hands on money, and they were being foreclosed for unpaid debts and taxes. And that had been dismissed in the scholarship as, they're just provincially paranoid. They're, just backcountry yokels who really don't understand what's going on. And I dug into the court records and found that, absolutely what they described as happening to them was not paranoia. It was even worse than they were describing. I remember going into Western Pennsylvania in the Westmoreland County Courthouse and asking them if I could see the sheriff's records of foreclosures. And they were like, well, you can see the execution dockets. And I was like, I didn't know what the hell I was doing. I was like, well, no, I don't want to see people killed. I want to see property taken. They're like, it's executions of property, right? It's executions of a judgment. You get a judge. They explained to me what that meant. And so I went down to the basement and I asked for to see the records over the 1780s and 90s. And the woman goes back to look to see what she can find and comes back out 15 minutes later, said, do you really want them all from that period? I'm like, yeah. Another 15 minutes goes by and suddenly I hear like this squeaky wheeled cart being rolled out. And the docket books are stacked up to her hip that are property executions. So these were things where people had lost, were a sheriff or constable was showing up at their house. And for me, that moment really transformed, for me, the understanding of the stakes involved in what was going on here. And so I think while Washington was wrapped up in his own particular moment at his own particular time and very important to him, for me, I increasingly saw the larger story of this as part of a broader counter-revolution against the revolution, which was not just about what was going on in Pennsylvania, but what was going on across the country. And that is starting with the war. And once it became clear that the colonies were going to win this war, that a lot of the elite began to change their minds about what this should all be about, right? When it was Britain, the whole thing was Republican ideology. And we're looking at talking about the model of of ancient Rome, where we want to avoid concentrations of economic and political power, like Britain was trying to do by eliminating paper money and taxing us in gold and silver and restraining our trade to benefit, the East India Company, or, concerns about the Bank of England and all the rest of that. Like, there was this big fear of Britain helping out big power, right? I mean, it's the Boston Tea Party and the other tea parties were against monopoly. Those were protests against monopoly. And so you have all of these protests which were against concentrations of economic and political power in the 1760s and 70s that the elite is behind. Like, they're like, no, if you take away our paper money, that's that's a tyranny. Tax us in gold and silver when we don't have money to pay, that's tyranny. And what we see is that after the war, they totally do this flip-flop. Like, there's this complete flip-flop where the elite begins to see paper money as a problem of democracy, and they want to eliminate it and privatize it, put it in the hands of private banks, which are a new creation on the American landscape. That they start taxing people in gold and silver. In large part, 90% of taxes went to pay off the war debt. These were IOUs from Congress that were concentrated in the hands of the affluent. There's only like the top 2,000 wealthiest Americans held, 90% of the war debt. And so the dynamics look very, very different once you take this sort of broader sweep. And what you see is among the elite is flip-flop, and suddenly they don't want to, they're not worried so much about trying to spread out political power and economic power, or fearful of concentrations of economic and political power. But once Britain's gone, now the whole goal is to concentrate economic and political power. And Hamiltonian finance is a big part of that. And that's what you see in the farm petitions in Western Pennsylvania. They're basically trying to tell everybody, this has been going, we fought against this before. This is what this whole revolution was about. And now they're doing it to us again. And that view, I think, is one that has been like, that's shaped my ideals, is the consistency of the way in which these small farmers are articulating their own vision of the revolution. And you see this flip-flop at the top. And so Washington, in that statement, realizes that, right? The elite is a lot less secure than we think. Right? I mean, the big move that they make in the counter-revolution was the Constitution, which gave them the power to be able to rewrite laws and to create a, quote, stronger barrier against democracy. And then gave them the fiscal power, stripping powers away from the states that they didn't like, right? Prohibiting the states from printing paper money, making contracts and debts payable in gold and silver. These are all things that they had wanted in the 1780s, but couldn't get at the state level, so they kick it up to the federal level. So there's a sense of nervousness about whether they'll be able to pull this off, because they recognize how people are unhappy with this, that they're doing something that the majority of the population is not happy about, because it represents really one of the greatest transfers of wealth and power from ordinary people to the elite in American history, right? The transfers of wealth in this period are just astonishing in the 1780s and 90s. So I think they realize what they're doing is unpopular. What they don't get, and what Washington didn't quite understood, which I think someone like James Madison understood quite a bit better, was that ordinary people in this time had a really hard time organizing politically. Right? And that they had a very hard time getting their act together. They've had a hard time finding ways to communicate and coordinate their activities. And as I show, part of the problem that ordinary people faced was that their protests, like the kinds of things that they had done against Britain and the kinds of things that they continue to do, like the pattern of rough music and protest and shutting down tax collection, had been very effective against Great Britain and was proving quite effective in the 1780s. But they wall themselves off, right? It's not about building bridges across county lines and getting out in electoral politics. Most of these people didn't even vote. And so they relied on protest, and that's their fatal flaw. And that's what Washington didn't see. And you have to remember, at the time, Washington's also terrified that there's going to be, of the French Revolution, and that there's going to be another French Revolution here, right? Then in France, they've risen up and lopped off the heads of the king and the queen, and Washington and the rest of the Federalists are terrified about the prospect of a similar revolution here. So they've greatly overestimated the ability. They haven't overestimated the upset of the people. What they have greatly overestimated is the ability of ordinary people to organize and mobilize. And quite frankly, so too did the people. And I think that's one of the big takeaways for me was that the people are often appeared like the rebels are often depicted as being sort of out of touch or whatever. And as far as their analysis of politics and what was happening to them, they weren't. They were spot on with what was going on. But when it comes to what to do about it and how to organize and mobilize, that's when they're off, because they imagined that somehow organization and mobilization would just happen, right? That they imagined just because they imagined everybody else is as pissed off about this as we are, that somehow is going to lead to united and collective action. And that's what they were really wrong about, and that's where they get crushed. So in retrospect, I don't think that their rebellion was as serious as Washington made it out to be, as a threat to the Republic, precisely because ordinary people had such a hard time mobilizing. And the terrific book that Paul wrote on Freese's rebellion, right? I mean, you see that these two, Eastern Pennsylvania, Western Pennsylvania, they aren't helping out each other and working together and coordinating their efforts. They're sort of at cross purposes here. And so by missing that category, that key category of organization and mobilization, and understanding it doesn't happen just because people are upset. It happens by human beings talking to one another and reaching out and finding ways to mobilize and communicate and coordinate. That was missing. That was missing from what was going on. And so I don't think ultimately Washington was correct in his assessment, because the organization behind it just simply wasn't there. It could have been there, and that's why he wanted to crush it. But I don't think it was the threat that he perceived it to be at the time. And again, I'll stop there.
Thank you, Terry. We've had a couple of questions come in while you guys have been giving your presentations, and I'm going to work those in as we go throughout this afternoon. I'd like to remind everyone, please, during this portion of our programming, to use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. It'll be a lot easier to track your questions through that than it would be through chat. So use the Q&A. I'll put up things that people ask for in chat for everyone to see. But any questions you have, please use that Q&A at the bottom of your screen. Thank you both for that. And I think what I'd like to do is ask you each a question along the same lines to really move us backward. Terry, you did an excellent job of rooting the Whiskey Rebellion and the resistors' grievances within the American Revolution and in all of the circumstances that created a debt that they were being taxed to repay. But I know that you also use a term in your book when you talk about the Whiskey rebels and the Freeze rebels. You talk about them as regulators and as regulation movements. And of course, the Shays rebels in Massachusetts referred to themselves as regulators. Can you talk about this deeper tradition of regulation that goes back into the pre-revolutionary years of the 1760s and its connection to Western Pennsylvania?
Yeah, all of that harkens back, the regulation, the term regulation, use of the term regulation, goes back to the North Carolina regulation, which was, against a combination of British policies and control of the local gentry, right? The elite control and using the court systems to their advantage, using, dominating the land offices out west, which were denying people title to the land. So it was about this idea that the government was captured by the very wealthy and worked for the very wealthy, and that if government does not work on behalf of the people, it is the right or duty of the people to regulate the government on behalf of the governed. That comes out of North Carolina, and it spreads all over the place, right? That concept and notion and term we can see repeated afterward, and gets bound up into the ideals of the revolution itself. In Pennsylvania, we have like an actual like person that we can trace with this, where it's Herman Husband, who was the supposed leader of the North Carolina regulation, who has to flee North Carolina because they've got a price on his head, and he's going to be hanged if they catch him. And he flees to Pennsylvania, and he's one of the people who's involved in all of this. And in fact, he's arrested at the end of the Whiskey Rebellion and put in jail in Philadelphia, and finally pardoned, and dies on the way home, an old and broken man. But this concept of regulation, the idea that people should regulate on behalf of, if the government is not operating on behalf of the people have the right and duty to regulate it, right? That's pretty central to the American Revolution. That's central to the mobilizations of the 1760s and 70s. The Carolina regulators get crushed right in the same kind of way, right? And in a ways where it's a lot of the revolution in presaging what comes next, because a lot of the people who crush them are not the crown and royal officials, it's the local gentry, many of whom become revolutionary leaders. And when the revolution comes, well, there was a lot of North Carolina regulators who are like, well, which side do I choose? The crown or these people who hanged my friends and neighbors and crushed us, and who still control the land office, and are still profiting off of us and controlling things inequitably. So these things flow through it, and you see the people in Massachusetts pick up the idea of regulation, and this idea of regulating government, I think, is central to the whole revolutionary project.
And Bill, if you could take us backward a little bit to the concept of Westsylvania that you talk about in the beginning of your book. And for those who don't know, there was a series of these Western independence movements in the 1770s and the 1780s and into the 1790s. Westsylvania, the state of Franklin, that's farther south. So, Bill, if you could talk about Westsylvania and its connection to the Whiskey Rebellion.
Well, it's just such a fascinating, it was to me when I found out about the Westsylvania, also Franklin you just mentioned. And I also sometimes see Vermont in this context as well, in a somewhat different way. But the idea of, nothing was all set, really. I mean, there were the 13, the 13 of the colonies formed by charter, various kinds of charters that had existed for a long time and so forth. And but there were people living around it's just the sense Westsylvania is a name. I mean, I guess I should explain a name some people in Western Pennsylvania gave to and Western Virginia and northern Western Maryland, maybe around the headwaters of the Ohio and in that general area, seeing it as a discrete region with its own name, and maybe it should be its own state. Maybe it should secede from the states that have claims on it and actually become its own organization. And the woods of the West or whatever. But in Vermont too, of course, was not a state. It was just a sort of a creation of Ethan Allen and his brothers with various land interests and so forth in a fight against New York for their own kind of sovereignty. Kind of making things up as you go along just has this kind of cool and exciting quality to it, because it's places that are outside the reach, the easy reach of the capitals of the existing colonies becoming states, all of which had claims on lands. They had conflicting border claims, of course. There was actual outright war between Pennsylvania and Virginia over these things. And so the Westsylvania idea, the idea that some people there really wanted to make their own place and look westward and get access to the Mississippi and not be controlled by Eastern capitals and so forth, not have this economic concentrated power telling them what to do. Have their own economies and their own access to credit and their own access to trade. This just has this quality of sort of improvisation, and also I think it is frightening, and maybe to a degree that, as Terry's talking about, maybe more frightening than the reality of what they could pull off would really suggest. But it's a frightening sense of potential fragmentation around the edges of what a Washington administration can control. Like, what if these places all start flaking off? and making alliances with foreign powers and so forth and so on. I mean, it seems like a kind of potential major threat to the sovereignty of the United States to have these self-determined concepts of what this place, West Sylvania, really is, what Vermont thinks it really is, what, and so forth and so on. So that theme exists before the revolution, kind of. It plays into the revolution in interesting ways, and it comes out of the revolution in ways that still, to this day, I think, give us some interesting problems.
Okay, I've got another question for both of you, and I'll stay with you, Bill, and then turn to Terry. We've talked about the grievance that these Western Pennsylvanians had, which was principally the excise on whiskey. And what that did is it placed an incredible burden on small farmers, small producers of whiskey. And why that was important was because whiskey was the way that you could convert corn and rye into a marketable product that would be sold all the way back east to Philadelphia and beyond. And so they were basically taxing these people's livelihoods, and the taxes fell heavier on small producers than large producers. And the tax money was being used, as Terry had said, to cover the war debts that had been collected by speculators over the course of the 1780s and early 1790s. And that's the principal grievance that they have, that they are being fleeced. But we know there are more. What are some of the other grievances that you came across, Bill?
Oh, well, I mean, I just mentioned access to the Mississippi. That's one. The fact that that if you're out there over the mountains, out there, they were there, looking eastward, looking westward. It would have been a lot more efficient for them. They could have there were markets available to them that were not available to them because the United States hadn't made appropriate deals with Spain to be able to move American product down the Mississippi toward New Orleans and those markets. For whiskey, for one thing, because that whiskey that was made there was very high quality according to the drinkers in the East, not just the locals. And I believe it was known as a sort of a brand as far away as New Orleans. So there's that, but there's all the other produce they were making. Well, like Washington and his people wanted all that produce flowing east. Naturally, they'd been investing in canals and other infrastructure to make that happen and dreaming about that for a long time. So Mississippi River access. Then there is the issue of constant conflict over whose land this was anyway, where, as I mentioned earlier, of course, in 1794, same year as the Whiskey Rebellion and the suppression of Western Pennsylvania, that same year, Washington finally succeeded in conquering that massive Indian territory. But that came late. I mean, white people were thinking they should be able to live there and had been for a long time, even before the revolution. And the nations that held that land definitely didn't think they had a right to be there. And so there was this constant conflict, intermittent, I guess, intermittent and fairly complicated at times. But from the native point of view, the revolution was just part of a 30-year fight over that issue, the issue of whose land is this? And so one of the grievances for white settlers in that area was that the federal government was not doing enough to protect them. Their state and local and federal government, new federal government, were not doing enough to protect them from what they saw as depredations carried out by native people. So it's true that it was not only a response, that the protests were not only a response to the spearhead of the elitism of the new country in terms of its economic power, which was Hamilton's whiskey tax as a source of revenue to fund the debt, pay a very tiny number, as Terry just said, of very well-off people their regular interest. By the way, tax-free interest, because no one talked about taxing interest income in those days. And it was designed by Hamilton it was designed to hit the smaller farmer harder also. It wasn't like, oh, that was a policy error. That was you can read the tax bill and see that. So it's a cluster of grievances, but it seems like that tax, as designed by Hamilton, made very, very clear what his intentions for the Western people were.
Thank you, Bill. And Terry, if you could pick up on that notion of Hamilton's purposeful design of a regressive tax, A, and B, one other grievance I'm interested in was their grievance about the existence of land speculators as well as debt speculators. So if you could pick up on Liz.
Yeah, I mean, if you look at it, I mean, the whole point is it's a same kind of catalog of list of ways in which the government is concentrating wealth and power at the public expense. And so I think some of that, I mean, that they're concerned about massive land speculation and land speculation that's going into the hands of land speculation companies and wealthy individuals who are amassing huge estates in these supposed frontier lands. And that's exactly what's going on. I mean, George Washington's one of the biggest perpetrators of that as far as like, he's got massive speculations. One of the reasons he's concerned about gaining control in these fragmentary, like Westsylvania places settling off is because he's got a boatload of land out in like on the Kennewa River. And he's worried about what happens if the people on those lands don't want to pay me or want to break away or whatever. So there's a lot of concern about that. Hamilton, the tax for Hamilton. I want to focus on actually another part which they mentioned, which kind of gets short shrift in here, is they attack basically all of Hamiltonian finance. One of the things that they go after is the bank, like the Bank of the United States being created. And to understand what they're talking about and why they're so upset about that, it's not just simply like boilerplate, like, oh, it's banks, we hate banks. Their own experiences in Pennsylvania of banks and private banking has been a disaster. That's a big part of the disaster, right? That under the colonial system of land banks and public loan offices and under the revolution, one of the first things they do when they get control of money, the new independent state is to start printing paper money and making some of that available to people through long-term low interest loans issued by the government, right? These are government loan programs that the British had them. The American revolutionaries put them through. We have them in the 1780s, and Robert Morris and the elite of Pennsylvania want to destroy those. They eliminate the public by eliminating paper money. They eliminate the public loan system, and they want to replace it with Robert Morris's Bank of North America, which Morris articulated as being a substitute for these public banking systems. And Hamilton's his guy, right? Hamilton is learning at the feet of Robert Morris. Most of what we call Hamiltonian finance is actually policies and ideas originally promoted by Robert Morris. Robert Morris was supposed to be Washington's first Treasury Secretary, but he declined the job and basically said, go with Hamilton. And what the Bank of North America did, they eliminated the public loans, which got lots of credit and money into the hands of ordinary people, because they had each county, the money was a total amount of money that they would put out there, and then the money was distributed into each county, and you could only get like £100 in loans. So it was like a lot of small loans that got into the hands of ordinary people. The Bank of North America, by contrast, in its first year operation, gave out like lots of loans, but how many went to farmers? One loan went to a farmer, and that's not even a farmer, right? I mean, this is not this. So they took a system that spread out currency and credit widely and eliminated it and replaced it with something which was a mercantile bank that operated only for the wealthy elite and mostly merchants in Philadelphia. The result of that was devastating for the economy, devastating for farmers, and it connects into land speculation, right? That people were watching their freeholds and farms that they had developed. They couldn't pay for them anymore. Their kids couldn't get credit to be able to buy new lands or develop the lands that they had. And so that financial privatization of finance and transferring the financial power of money and credit from government to a government that had programs that got money into the hands of ordinary people to a private bank that put it only in the hands of the elite, devastated the economy, and is part of why we had so much land speculation going on among the affluent, right? That under the Bank of North America, and they're all speculating it, even though the bank's bylaws say you can't use land. Most of James Wilson's land speculation, James Wilson, architect of the Constitution, Supreme Court justice, who has to flee the Supreme Court to escape his creditors, leave the bench to flee his creditors, right? That was funded by the Bank of North America. So what this privatization of finance did was it provided far fewer loans to ordinary people, but created a huge pool of capital unprecedented in America that was now available to the affluent to invest in huge amounts of land.
Now, I want to turn, we just got a question in, and it's right in the direction I was prepared to turn anyway. So thank you very much, Jim, asking this question. And I'll wrap my question in with Jim's. My question is this. What are the pretexts and the terms that the Washington administration used to put down this rebellion? And Jim asks, based on Washington's justification with the 10th Amendment as the background, how or where is there a line drawn on the limits of power of the federal government? By the time we get to the 21st century, the 10th Amendment seems to be pretty much a done deal. So you want to go ahead and take that, Terry, and I'll turn to Bill.
Yeah, I think in some ways, thinking about even the 10th Amendment, right? I mean, part of it is, I think, our conception of rights in the Constitution and even the Bill of Rights is different than the legal systems that we have in place. Like, we're used to the sort of the Supreme Court case and the interpreting the meaning of the 10th Amendment. There's a lot more of what was called popular constitutionalism back then, where people would enforce their own ideas of what they thought the Constitution was supposed to mean. And I think I think it's hard to draw the line on federal power, especially as it's used to insurrections, war, and violence. Once it's become some kind of threat, like once there's a threat perceived, civil rights and the Bill of Rights has tended to go out the window, right? I mean, the first casualty of any war is civil rights and the Bill of Rights. And that's not a purely American thing, right? Look at the French and the Declaration of Rights of Man and Citizen. Really powerful set of rights, but they were never enacted, right? They were never, the first government that's violating them was the government that imposed that created them, and then imposed the terror. So I think that whole question of rights and where the line is always murky and contingent and fragile, right? I mean, I don't think that's and Hamilton wants them to run out the army even after people are starting to protest, which Washington is sympathetic to. And goes to Edmund Randolph, who says, no, that's not, you need something more concrete to go on. So Hamilton goes and basically manufactures an uprising, right? I mean, goes and presses Western Pennsylvania hard, targets exactly where he's going to do, and press them with prosecutions and to generate the kind of event, sort of a wag the dog kind of event, which is not unusual in history and in American history, where we've seen provoking other groups as a way to put federal force through. I mean, look at like the Black Panthers and AIM, the American Indian Movement. I mean, they were just targeted by the FBI in ways that allowed them to come down super hard with federal force by basically provoking action. So it's not new, and it's tenuous and fragile.
And Bill, picking up from there to talk about the actual suppression of the rebellion. So Washington put together a federalized force of militia from many, many states that all came together at Carlisle, Pennsylvania. And then he led them in uniform as the president of the United States on a march from Carlisle across the Allegheny Mountain, or the Blue Mountain, to Bedford, at Fort Bedford, Pennsylvania. And it was the largest military force he had ever commanded, by a factor of more than 2, I believe, during the American Revolution. So if you could tell us a little bit about that use of force to follow up on Jim's question.
Yeah, I mean, it also brings us to the importance question, like how important was it? Depends who you are. As Terry just noted, I mean, it was very important to Hamilton to have a military suppression of the populace somewhere. And you can see this in his correspondence with Washington. May have overstated, maybe tactically overstated the likelihood of how organized the people they were going to suppress could get, but it was important to them to do it, to show that they could really, and to show that these elite financial systems were going to be enforced kind of regardless. And so Backing off the 10th Amendment a little bit and rolling back towards some of the earlier amendments are in that list, I don't think there's any question but that that rights were violated. If you believe those rights are anything more than just paper. I mean, it was not illegal for Washington to invoke the Militia Act and to kind of have carte blanche to do some things because Congress wasn't in session, so he didn't have to go to them. And Hamilton worked that situation. I mean, I say in my book that he and Bradford, Attorney General, rushed certain writs into the docket so they could enforce them under a much stricter law, deliberately in order to incite an incident that would create what Washington had cautioned Hamilton they needed, which was a last resort. Like, we've tried everything with these people. He definitely tried to create a situation in which no one could argue that the place was in rebellion. Now, you know, it's a speculation to a degree. It's very interesting that in Thomas Slaughter's book on the Whiskey Rebellion, in his notes, he's quite clear that he believes Hamilton did do this piece of chicanery around rushing writs into the docket, but he doesn't say it so clearly in his text. I kind of relied on his notes and my own reading and that stuff to get to basically say it, because I think that's clearly what happened. And so what we see is this desire to use military force against the citizenry. We see Hamilton actually speculating to Jay a couple of years earlier, as he's imagining, how will this go down? He's like, maybe, what if the president himself shows up wherever this thing that I want to happen is going to happen? He hadn't even decided yet where it should be. Thought maybe it should be in North Carolina. So you've got an actual, like, where do you draw the line on federal force? I mean, you know, the executive branch wants to carry out a military operation against the citizenry somewhere. Washington did it, and Hamilton did. Washington wanted to do it carefully and politically, and Hamilton was, you know, as usual, just like, let's go, let's go, let's go. But they were as one in this, really. And when they actually carried out that suppression, I mean, Washington turned back at Bedford. Hamilton and Henry Lee carried it out. They came down on that part of the country with massive force and unwarranted search and seizure, indefinite detentions without charge. They had a federal judge along, and his role was explicitly subordinated to the military. You know, there's just a lot of stuff they wrote. They made it. Hamilton's correspondent shows to Washington. Writing to Washington is now getting himself farther and farther away from this scene of oppression. But Hamilton's writing to him saying, if we found a guy, you know, picking examples, even though there was no evidence, it's quite explicit in his correspondence with Washington that they understood they were trying to find examples. I also see Hamilton doing a little bit of goal shifting, classic goal shifting, where Washington thought there was going to be better evidence gathered against the people they actually did arrest than there really was. And Hamilton was kind of like, no, but, you know, we're going to make a point here. But it was brutal. I mean, it was brutal what happened, and it was illegal in terms of the kinds of rights that were trounced there.
Now, looking after the rebellion, did the regulators win anything? We talked about their grievances being the excise tax itself, but also the inability of the federal government to protect them from Indian raids, and the inability of the federal government to open the Mississippi River to the traffic of their goods down the Ohio and out through the port of New Orleans. Did they get anything out of this movement? Go ahead, Bill.
That's just such a huge, interesting question. Well, you know, the tax was repealed in the Jefferson, you know, era. The Indian country was conquered. That's true. The benefit redounded, of course, to the speculators that Terry was just talking about, to Washington himself, whose portfolio of Western lands went up by something like 50% in value after he had used his presidential power to carry out the suppression of the Whiskey Rebels. And of course, concomitant with that was the conquest of Indian country and the beginning of what really became the treaty period. And people talk about Jackson as an Indian remover, and that's fair enough. But I mean, this has a deep history that begins right with the founding of the country and this attempt to establish sovereignty in the West. So, you know, yeah, I mean, did they win anything? I mean, it depends which frame you're looking from. I mean, some things were better, but then, you know, the excise tax comes back. We pay excises on whiskey today. I don't know that it's like driving us crazy, and I don't know if it's associated with all of the same issues. In the bigger, in the kind of the biggest picture thing, I mean, I'll go back to what I kind of think, which is that I don't feel like some of the democratic ideas of regulation and some of the ideas about level playing fields and equal access to credit and so forth and so on. I don't see these things, and also a participation of labor in a concerted way in government. I don't see these things sort of emerging and popping back up in the Jefferson period or the Jackson period, or in the states-oriented kind of development of democracy via the development of the two political parties, nationally organized political parties. I mean, obviously we get more democracy for white men without property because we stop having qualifications and so forth within the states. So in that sense, that's a victory. Of course, there's loss of rights involved in that too for free black men and for women. But in terms of the visions of, say, a Herman Husband, who Terry just brought up, I mean, the vision of Herman Husband, I don't see coming to fruition in Jacksonian America. So I think, no, in some ways, no, they didn't really win anything then, but maybe later some of those same American themes about certain kinds of equality did begin to gain some traction. But to me, it took a long time.
And Terry, question for you. We've been using the term rebel, regulator. Another term that was used during 1794 was the Western Pennsylvania insurrection. That term was also used for Shays Rebellion. It was used for Freeze Rebellion. And I got a phone call on January 7th from a reporter who asked me a question. He was doing a story about the January 6th insurrection at the Capitol building, asking me to assess the moment historically in comparison to Shays, whiskey, and Freeze rebellions. How would you have answered that question?
I did answer that question. I was there, believe it or not, at the went to witness Stop the Steal. My partner's a photographer. It's a hobby. She was there and guilted me into going. She's like, "You're an historian, we've got to." And she had taken a lot of photographs of protests during the Trump era, and wanted to see this one. So we were like right up against the Capitol building in the backside. We got there late, and I got asked. Eventually, got asked. I wrote a Twitter thread that went viral and ended up on doing news media around the world, who asked exactly that question. And my response to it was talking about the parallel, not so much the term and name, but really what are the parallels? And I think one of the parallels is one I think I mentioned already, which is that it's a lot of the people on January 6th, 2021 imagined themselves as patriots. They talked about themselves as patriots. They imagined themselves as continuing the American Revolution, and the whole mindset was that we're all one, not even just beyond the crazy QAnon, like where we go one, we go all nonsense. But there was a sense that they represented the people and that the people were united. And they even expect, for example, law enforcement there to basically be on their side. They thought everybody should be on their side, and that like law enforcement was going to turn around and join them and take the Capitol with them. And we see the same kind of and it's delusional. Like what they were, that was a mass sort of delusion, a self-deception. And it, from whatever, bubble, Fox News-ish bubble they were in, right-wing media bubble they're in, where everybody says and thinks the same thing. Well, you could see the similar kind of thing in Western Pennsylvania in 1794, that they believed that that everybody was the same and the people were all on their side. And yes, that's true that people may have all had similar, the majority of the population white population had similar kinds of grievances and concerns. But that doesn't mean they're all on the same page, right? Doesn't mean that people are all thinking the same kinds of actions should be taken or even identified the same kind of problems. And so what the so-called whiskey rebels imagined was that the army was going to come and let them come, because they're all going to put down their guns, or they're going to turn around on the federal forces, and we're going to win. right? That's why by David Bradford, as I was saying, like, go to war, like, let's fight this out because we're not going to fight because the people are on our side. And in that, they were the 1794 so-called rebels were terribly deluded about this and misguided as they were from the start in recognize and not appreciating the organizing problem that they faced, which I guess is it's good in today's context that we're not going to see more, hopefully, takeovers of the Capitol, the U.S. Capitol again anytime soon.
Yeah, and the one thing that I had said that all three of those insurrections in the 1780s and 90s had officials from judges to state politicians to U.S. representatives who were misrepresenting information to these regulators and giving them that sense that the impossible would be possible, that the federal army or that the Massachusetts army would put down its weapons or join them. No one was more surprised to be fired upon at Springfield than Daniel Shays. Absolutely shocked him that it happened. And I think it was a shock to Western Pennsylvania in 1794. And you looked at Freeze Rebellion in 1799, and they were saying, hey, our old friends, the Whiskey Rebels, are going to march over and help us. And we'll all be fine. And the new army that's going to come up, they'll, of course, see it our way. And they were being told these things by judges, by elected representatives. So there's a lot of similarity there. Well, we're come to the end of our hour. I want to thank the both of you very much for the time that you've spent, not just in this last hour, but in your careers writing about this subject and this very important subject of American democracy. One thing that I saw come out of today's event is that the importance of the Whiskey Rebellion was not putting down this insurrection, but the importance is for us in knowing that we have a democracy in which we can express grievances and fight against the centralization of and the concentration of power and wealth. That was the story in the 1790s. We're living in a day and age today where power and wealth has never, ever been concentrated in as few hands as it is right now. And that we still have it within our own hands to see to a democratic future. So thank you very much for joining us, everyone out there, for the questions that you have. Thank you to Bill and Terry, to Chris Kendall, to Chance, and everybody at the National Association of Scholars. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful